Hello, lovelies. I'm Lex Carline, and this is Seriously Now. Now, if you're new here, thank you for joining, and if you're an old hat, welcome back. I sincerely hope that you're all having a wonderful week so far, and there's actually been some big news in the true crime world. Now, if any of you have heard of Muriel McKay, it's okay, because I hadn't either. She was murdered in December of 1969 after a bungled robbery. Basically, she was mistaken for Rupert Murdoch, the media guy, his first wife. Wow, after 55 years, one of her killers is finally ready to tell her family where the body is. How gracious of them. Or maybe it's because Muriel's family were prepared to pay a farmer £40,000 to dig up his land because that's where they think she's buried. Hopefully, this means that the family are finally going to get some closure, and yes, we will cover Muriel's story in the future. Now, today we are going to talk about one of the cases that's probably going to live on in true crime infamy. Definitely in the UK, anyway. It is full of all sorts of vile and disgusting things. If you can think about it, pretty much it happens. So trigger warning. Although, given what we generally talk about here, it always feels a bit daft giving a trigger warning, but here we are, just in case. As you may have guessed by the episode title, we're off to Gloucester and the long-since demolished 25 Cromwell Street. But first we need to go back to the beginning. And this is looking like it's going to be our first two-parter. So today we will go around some of the background, bits and bobs, how they got to be in Cromwell Street. And then next time we will go into some of the more heinous crimes in detail. And then the trial and convictions. So yes, let's jump in, shall we? Frederick Walter Stephen West was born on the 29th of September 1941 in Bickerton Cottage, Muchmarcle, which is a little village in Herefordshire. His parents were Walter Stephen West, who was a very strict disciplinarian, and overprotective mum Daisy Hannah Hill. Fred was the first child to survive, and his parents had a total of 8, but unfortunately 2 were born sleeping. When he was 5, the family moved into the namesake cottage of Moorcroft Farm, still in Muchmarcle, and it was very, very basic, with no electricity, and it was heated by a log fire. The West family were very poor, dirt poor. All the children had chores and did seasonal work on the farm. Girls picked hops and strawberries, and the boys harvested wheat and hunted rabbits. So because of this, Fred West actually developed quite a strong work ethic. But he also developed a taste for petty theft. Can't afford it? I'll just take it. Now, Fred was Mummy's favourite, and he was definitely a Mummy's boy. Maybe because he'd been the first child to survive? Who knows? Now, Fred would later claim that he was first introduced to sex by his mother, at the tender age of 12. He also claimed that he committed bestiality in his early teens. Ew. And believed that incest was perfectly normal, and apparently that stemmed from his dad interfering with his sisters. Such a, wonderful environment. Now, Fred's youngest brother Doug did dismiss these claims as nothing more than fantasy. But is that just because Doug didn't witness it? Again, who really knows? So Fred wasn't the sharpest tool in the shed. He was barely literate, and his classmates described him as scruffy, dim, lethargic, and he was often in trouble. Jump to 1957, and teenage Fred and brother John would go to youth club in Ledbury. Now, because the brothers had very thick Herefordshire accents, like we were kind of Herefordshire accent, be from there, so it'd be all right, and Ledbury being a little bit posher, the boys were labelled as country bumpkins, and we all know the stigma attached to that label. Well, in Fred's case, wasn't far off. Now, at the club, Fred would, quote, aggressively bother women. He was one of those who thought that women were just there for his pleasure, and they're just objects to use however he wanted, really. Apparently, though, there were those who actually accepted his advances. Come on, ladies, you can do better. But they were left, shocker, highly unsatisfied, because Fred was only concerned with his own satisfaction. At age just 17, Fred was in a very serious motorbike accident, and he suffered a massive head injury, which resulted in a fractured skull. Now where have we heard serious head trauma in a true crime case before? No, we've never come across that, have we? Richard Ramirez, Ed Gein, John Wayne Gacy, Peter Sutcliffe, just to name a few. Fred remained unconscious for around about a week after the accident, and he also suffered a broken arm and leg. He would therefore walk with braces for months, and this is said to be where he developed a deep hatred of hospitals, and also where his quick temper and fits of rage came from. Just 2 years later, at 19, and Fred suffered another head injury. Bodes really well, doesn't it? This time, he tried groping a girl outside the youth club. But, and good on her, she punched him for his unwanted advances and he fell 2 floors from a fire escape. Now, I don't condone violence, but I'd imagine no didn't mean too much to a cretin like Fred West, so she made sure he understood the no. No means no, people. In 1961, Fred's 13-year-old sister Kitty confessed that Fred, who was then 20, had been raping her and even got her pregnant. Kitty didn't have the baby, and I'm not sure whether that's because of natural reasons or whether there was some kind of intervention. But as well as all life being precious, with that gene pool, it was possibly a blessing. Incest does not a good human make. Now, Fred would be arrested for this, and once that happened, he actually confessed that he'd been molesting young girls for months. His reasoning? Doesn't everyone do it? No. No, sir, they don't. Although she claimed to be disgusted, Fred's mum was willing to defend her precious boy. So those perks of being mummy's favourite. Now, mysteriously, or not, just before she was about to testify against her brother, Kitty changed her mind and refused. Mummy dearest in one's ear, methinks. So, despite no legal repercussions for his reprehensible behaviour, there would be elsewhere, thankfully. Most of the family disowned Fred, and he was banished from the family home. See ya. Luckily for Fred, though, Aunt Violet came to the rescue and he was able to stay with her. A year or so later, he would reconcile with both of his parents, but understandably, the rest of the family remained a bit wary. Just no thanks. In November 1962, Fred West married Catherine Bernadette Costello, also known as Rena. He was 21 and she was 18. They had actually met at a dance hall in Muchmarcle in 1960, and then they dated for a few months before Rena, who was from Coatbridge in Lanarkshire, went back to Scotland. They wouldn't be reacquainted until September of 1962. Yes, 2 months before they got married. And to add to that, Rena was pregnant by an Asian bus driver, and it's speculated that she ran back to England due to her family's displeasure at her being pregnant with a mixed-race baby. Remember, it was the 60s. Not that that makes racism okay, just that it was different times. Initially, the couple stayed with Fred's Aunt Violet, and then they moved, or in Rena's case, moved back to Coatbridge, where Fred West worked as an ice cream van driver. Rena's daughter Charmaine was born in March of 1963, and she was obviously of mixed descent, and therefore visibly not Fred's, so the couple concocted a story. They said that Rena had tragically suffered a late miscarriage and that this baby had been adopted. Convenient, but then stranger things have happened. Shortly after Charmaine's birth, the family moved to Savoy Street in the Bridgerton district of Glasgow. And this is where Rena's second daughter and Fred's first biological child, Anna Marie, was born in July 1964. Excuse my stomach if you can hear it. I have eaten. It's just digesting. So the family did have a nanny, Isa McNeil, and she, along with other neighbours, said that Rena was a considerate mother, struggling to raise 2 kids. Remember, Rena was still very young herself. Now, I'm not saying that means that she would be incapable of looking after 2 kids, but I know at that age, I would not have been able to look after 2 kids. I could barely look after myself. I mean, I'm not much better now, but... Now, Isa and the neighbours also said that Fred treated the kids harshly. A slight understatement, but... He kept the 2 girls in the bottom bunk of a set of bunk beds, and he had fitted bars to make it a cage, basically. So they were only allowed out when he was at work. Some people just shouldn't have children. Through Isa, the Wests would meet a young woman called Anne McFall. She was just 16 years old and had been completely devastated when a workplace accident killed her boyfriend. She would come to spend a lot of time at the Wests' flat. Now, given that Fred is such an upstanding character, I'm sure you will all be floored to learn that he admitted to numerous affairs during the early years of his marriage to Rena. He even fathered a child in the Gorbals area of Glasgow. Methinks that child had a lucky escape. Now, in retaliation, rather than doing the more sensible thing of leaving, Rena had her own affair with a man called John McLaughlin. Please don't do this, guys. If it goes south, just get out. Please. Fred would one day discover the pair, and I say discover, the pair in an embrace. So naturally, he punched John. John punched him back, and then Fred pulled a knife. He skimmed the knife over John's abdomen, but rather than back off, John punched Fred a second time, and Fred was said to stop defending himself. Love it. Not afraid of Fred. I get this kind of thick Scottish accent in my head laughing at Fred, and wish I could pull it out and play it for you. John and Rena would continue their affair. John hated the fact that Fred would beat her. He hated the bruises and the black eyes. So every time Fred would beat Rena, John would beat Fred. And Fred still didn't learn. One day, in John's presence, Fred smacked Charmaine across the back of the head for asking for an ice cream from his van. An ice cream. From her stepdad's van. So John beat Fred again. Yay. Again, I don't condone violence, but sometimes, unfortunately, that's the only language some people understand. Slightly. Now, in fact, years later, John would say of Fred, and this is a direct quote, "He couldn't tackle a man, but he wasn't so slow in attacking women." Which is the lowest, scummiest kind of man. Can't stand his ground against other men, so he tackles those at a biological disadvantage, women and children. Utter bastard. Now, for Fred's first murder. On the 4th of November, 1965, Fred accidentally reversed his ice cream van over 3-year-old Henry William Feeney, killing him instantly. The police wrote it off as an accident, but many locals who witnessed the event were convinced it was deliberate. Now, given the potential blowback from the accident, Fred, who, let's remember, was really a coward, the following month moved to Gloucester with the kids, where he rented a caravan on a park. Now, a little bit of geography for you in case you don't know the area well. Gloucester is about 16 miles from Muchmarcle, where Fred grew up. It's also where I was born, because, I know you love these little nuggets about me so much. Rena would join them a couple of months later in the February of 1966, and she brought with her Isa and Anne McFall, who both hoped to find work in England. Now, shortly after they all returned to England, Fred began working as a lorry driver for a local abattoir, or slaughterhouse. By now, Fred was a controlling, domineering force over all 3 women, with Rena and Isa really feeling the brunt of his violence. And I'm sorry to say that he had also begun abusing his stepdaughter. And I don't just mean mentally. He reportedly sexually abused her, and also encouraged his wife to prostitute herself to make up for the pittance that he earned. Couldn't just let her have a normal job, could he? Fed up with Fred and his moods, the domestic violence and his ever-increasing sexual demands, Isa and Rena, along with John McLaughlin, who they had called to help them get away with the children, formed an escape plan. John, along with his friend John Trotter, who happened to be Isa's boyfriend, would secretly drive down to Bishop's Cleeve, collect the escapees and take them all back to Scotland. The two women also told Anne of their plan, presumably to save her as well. But as she was completely and utterly infatuated with Fred and believed his promise to marry her, it's likely that she was the one who told him about the escape plan. I'd love to tell you that they all got away and lived happily ever after, but I'm afraid I am the bearer of bad news. Fred arrived at the meeting point in time to catch everyone, and Anne calmly told the others that she was actually going to be staying as the children's nanny. Fred and John McLaughlin fought, and Fred was actually struck a few times whilst holding Charmaine and Anne-Marie. The police were called, and Fred kept the kids, which is a sickening turn of events. And Fred also threatened Rena that he would kill her if he ever saw her again. Now remember, Charmaine isn't even Fred's, and the police still let him keep her. So the two Johns, Isa and Rena, returned to Scotland. Now, despite Fred's threat, Rena would actually travel back and forth quite frequently to visit her children, at Fred's, for a time. She did fall out with Anne, though. Well, not surprising, but she fell out with her over her matriarchal presence around Rena's children, acting like she was their mama, as if ruining their escape plan wasn't reason enough. Now, the visitation seemed to work until the 11th of October 1966, when Rena stole some of Fred's things and went back to Glasgow. She was reported, arrested, and hauled back to Gloucester. The following month, Rena would be sentenced to 3 years probation. Fred would testify against her, and he did finally admit that he and Anne were living together, but, surprise, surprise, he lied and said that Anne was imminently returning to Scotland. After Rena's trial, Anne did move, but it wasn't back to Scotland. Oh no, she moved out of Fred's caravan and into one of her own. And after the conviction, Rena would still alternate between Fred's caravan and Scotland. Now, letters that Anne had sent to her family and also to Isa showed that she genuinely thought a relationship with Fred could offer her a better life. I'm failing to see how. What did he have that was so enticing? Really? Someone explain it, because I am not getting it. Anne would continually try to convince Fred to divorce Rena so that he could marry her. Bless her. Young and delusional. And I think most of us can say we've been there at some stage. The young and delusional part, not the obsessed with marrying Fred West part. No. Honey, if he's not divorcing her after she stole his stuff, tried to run away with the kids in the middle of the night, he's not gonna divorce her. But sadly, Anne would never get her wish. In July of 1967, 18-year-old Anne McFall, who just so happened to be 8 months pregnant, vanished. Anne's remains, and sadly the remains of her unborn child, were found buried at the edge of a cornfield between Muchmarcle and Kempley, almost 30 years later in 1994. Anne had been dismembered, and her limbs had been carefully disarticulated, which is the removal at the joint rather than amputation, which goes through the bone. Anne was missing some of her phalange bones, which are your finger and toe tips, and it was assumed that these were kept as trophies, like so many killers do. Sickos. Anne was never reported missing. Obviously, Fred initially denied the murder, but years later when he was arrested, spoiler alert, he does eventually get caught, he admitted to stabbing Anne to death after an argument. Although this confession was inconclusive with the findings, because Anne's wrists were bound with a cord from a dressing gown, and that clearly suggests that she was restrained before she was killed. Just a month later, and Rena would go back to live with Fred, even after all the abuse. The things we do for our kids. Don't do this. The family then relocated from the Timberland Caravan Park to the Lake House Caravan Park, and initially the relationship improved. But the following year, Rena left again, and again left the girls in Fred's care. On his own with his daughters, when he found himself with no one to care for them, he would temporarily place them in the care of Gloucestershire Social Services. If only they hadn't been returned to him. But more on that later. Now it's time to talk about the background of Rose West. Yay! Rosemarie Pauline Letts was born on the 27th of November 1953 in Northam, Devon. Her parents were William Andrew Letts, also known as Bill, and Daisy Gwendolyn Fuller. Rose was the fifth of 7 children, and the Letts family, just like the Wests, were very, very poor. Rose's mum suffered badly with depression, and at one point she had electroconvulsive therapy, and this was done both during and immediately after her pregnancy with Rose. Now I'm going to go out on a limb here and say that this may have caused some prenatal development issues. Rose, like Fred, performed badly at school. She was often labelled as a daydreamer. As a teenager, Rose's parents separated, and after living with her mother for 6 months, she went to live with her father in Bishop's Cleeve. Bill Letts was a paranoid schizophrenic, and he was prone to extreme violence. Sound like somebody else? He would also repeatedly sexually abuse both Rose and her oldest sister Patricia, and they chose to go back to that over living with their mum. I'm not sure he's more of a wrong 'un in the end, Fred or Rose. Match made in hell. Apparently, when she started puberty, Rose was fascinated with her developing body, which there's nothing wrong with that. But parading around either semi or fully naked in front of your younger brother, or in this case her younger brother Graham, because there was more than one, yeah, that's not okay. That's just weird. When she was 13, Rose would sneak into her younger brother's room and molest 9-year-old Graham and the youngest sibling Gordon. So that's another tick on the we did the same things as kids for Fred and Rose. Now the two would actually meet at a bus stop in Cheltenham in early 1969. Rose had just turned 15 and Fred was 27, which is just more ick in a case overloaded with it. Had they been a bit older, that age gap's not so bad, but 15 and 27. Now initially, Rose was repulsed by Fred's dishevelled appearance, but soon enough she was flattered by the attention that he paid to her. I suppose we can all be a bit guilty of that. Now the first 2 times Fred asked her out, Rose said no. If only she'd kept saying no. But she did allow him to walk her home. Rose had a job in a bread shop. I'd get so fat. Bread is a weakness. One day, Fred managed to convince a random lady off the street to take Rose in a gift and to tell her that it was from the man outside. A few minutes later, in swaggered Fred, asked Rose if she'd finally go out with him that night. And at last she said yes. Their relationship would begin shortly after. And Rose very quickly became a frequent visitor to Fred's caravan. Stepdaughter Charmaine and daughter Anna Marie were still living there with him, so Rose became a willing childminder. She left her job at the bread shop, but she had an agreement with Fred that he would have to pay her just enough so that her parents thought she still had the job. Sneaky. It was quite apparent to teenage Rose that these girls had been neglected, so initially she was said to treat them with real care and affection. Man that she's dating neglects his children, and she stayed. Sad. She could have got out of there and got the kids out of there. It could have been a completely different story. In the early days, Rose would even make Fred drive her and the girls around to pick wildflowers. See, little nuggets like that, and then you hear the rest of the things they did, and it's just like, ugh. A few months into the relationship, and Rose would finally introduce Fred to her parents. And it went about as well as you could imagine. Her mother was completely unimpressed with Fred and all his arrogant, boastful behaviour. She actually correctly labelled him as a pathological liar. And Rose's father rightly did not approve of the relationship. Rose was still legally a child. And he threatened Fred and promised to call social services if the relationship continued. And after both parents forbade the relationship, they did in fact report it to Gloucester Social Services. Because obviously underage Rose was having a sexual relationship with a much older man, but there were also rumours of her prostituting herself from Fred's caravan. August 1969, and Rose was put in a home for troubled teens in Cheltenham, and here she was only able to leave under controlled conditions. These controlled conditions included weekend visits home, where she would go and visit Fred. What were the parents doing? What was the point in sending her to a home? Unless it was just quite simply, well, this is inappropriate and we need to be seen to be doing the right thing situation, but we don't really care. On her 16th birthday, funnily enough, Rose would leave the home. And she would have moved straight in with Fred, but he was serving a 30-day sentence for theft and unpaid fees, so she had to wait for him to get out. In a final attempt to get Rose away from Fred, her father had her examined by a police surgeon in February 1970, and they confirmed Rose's pregnancy. Rose was taken into care, but she would be discharged on the 6th of March after agreeing to terminate her pregnancy. After she was discharged, Rose went straight to go and live with Fred, and this resulted in her father banning her from ever returning to his house. Soon after moving in together, the couple would move from the caravan site to a ground floor flat in Midland Road in Gloucester. Rose would give birth to her first child, Heather Ann, on the 17th of October 1970. There is still speculation that Fred was not actually the father of the girl, but that Heather Ann was sired by her maternal grandfather. Yeah, I told you this case has everything. Not even 2 months later, and Fred would go to prison for about 6 months for the theft of tyres and a tax disc. God, tax disc. Can't remember how long they've been discontinued. Now, Rose was just 17 by this point, and she was left in charge of all 3 girls. And she had also begun demanding that Charmaine and Anna Marie called her mother. Yeah, okay. Anna Marie would later say that she and Charmaine were subjected to extensive physical and emotional abuse, frequently. She said Charmaine would refuse to cry, which would infuriate Rose, but she herself would be submissive and emotional during the abuse. Tracy Giles, who was Charmaine's friend and she lived in the flat above them, one day walked into the West's flat, believe her mother had sent her to ask for some milk. She walked in unannounced, as kids will do if the door's unlocked and you know the person, and she saw something that must have absolutely horrified her. She saw her friend, naked, standing on a chair, with her hands tied behind her back with a belt. Tracy said Rose had a wooden spoon in her hand, and you can use your imagination on that one, and that Charmaine was calm and unconcerned, whilst Anna Marie stood by the door completely expressionless. These poor girls. Hospital records from the 28th of March 1971 show that Charmaine had been treated in A&E for a severe puncture wound to her left ankle at Gloucester Royal Hospital. And as is often the case with abusers, Rose said it was from a household accident. Now, Rose would take all 3 girls to visit Fred in prison on the 15th of June, shortly before his release. And then it gets horrifically sad. It's believed that Rose killed Charmaine shortly after this visit. She was just 8 years old. Forensic odontology, which is the scientific study of the structure and diseases of the teeth, confirmed that Charmaine had been killed whilst Fred was still incarcerated. Tracy and her mother had moved from the upstairs flat in the April, but came by to see Charmaine in the June. But they were told by Rose that Charmaine had gone to live with her mother, and, quote, bloody good riddance. Now, we know Rose wasn't of the highest intelligence, and this was further emphasised by the lack of consistency in her stories. She said to some that Rena had taken Charmaine to live in Bristol, but told school that it was London they'd gone to. Now obviously poor Anna Marie wondered why her mother had taken her sister but left her behind. And Rose disgustingly put this down to Charmaine's biology and told Anna, "She wouldn't want you, love. You're the wrong colour." The sad thing is, though, that even through the years of abuse, Charmaine always believed that her mother would come and rescue her. Oh, baby girl. Charmaine's body would be stored in the coal cellar until Fred was out of prison. Then he buried her naked body in the backyard, close to the door. Her eventual post-mortem in the 90s, over 20 years after her disappearance, indicated Charmaine had been severed at the hip. But this may have been due to building work that Fred carried out in 1976. He remained adamant to the end that he did not dismember her. But she was missing her patella, kneecap, finger, wrist, toe, and ankle bones. More trophies, presumably. Now, as we know, every time Rena and Fred called it quits, she would maintain a sporadic relationship with her daughters. She did, however, visit Fred's family in Muchmarcle towards the end of August 1971 to ask about her children. How are they? Where are they? Christine, who was one of Fred's sisters, said that Rena seemed very, very anxious and depressed about her girls, which, as a mother, I can understand that. Rena did manage to get her hands on Fred's Midland Road address, and off she went, presumably to confront him and to rehash their custody agreement. That would be the last time that Rena Costello was seen alive. Her body would remain undiscovered until 1994, buried near a cluster of trees known as Yew Tree Coppice at Letterbox Field, Muchmarcle. Now, she had been dismembered, placed in carrier bags, and then buried. It was likely that she'd been strangled whilst drunk in the back of Fred's car. Rena's body was found with a short piece of metal piping, which suggested that she had more than likely been restrained and sexually assaulted. Now, on to the 29th of January 1972, and this is when Fred and Rose got married, and she officially became Rosemary West. But there were no friends or family present, it was just at the registry office in Gloucester. And just a few months later, the newlyweds would move with their children into the now infamous 25 Cromwell Street, Gloucester. And by then, Rose was pregnant with her second child. The house was originally a council-owned property, but Fred would later buy it for £7,000. Back when buying houses was actually affordable for most people and not the money-grabbing shitshow it is today. They turned many of the upstairs bedrooms into bedsits so they could have lodgers to supplement their income. Not a bad idea. The family would reside on the ground floor, and lodgers were not permitted to enter, and nor were they allowed in the garden. Wonder why? Now, as the kitchen was on the ground floor, Fred did install a wash basin and a cooker up on the first floor. Rose's second daughter, May June West, was born on the 1st of June 1972, and I can't help but wonder if when she was born was the contributing factor to her name. Wasn't long after May's birth that Rose began advertising her services in a local contact magazine, and Fred actively encouraged her to seek clients from Gloucester's West Indian community. Her working name was Mandy, and she had her own business room set aside in the house, simply called Mandy's Room. Now Fred, who was a long-time voyeur, someone who enjoys watching others have sex, and he particularly enjoyed watching his wife with her clients, so he installed several peepholes. And as well as the peepholes, Fred had a baby monitor installed in the room so he could listen wherever he was in the house. Mandy's room also had a bar and a red light to show when she was otherwise engaged, and it even had a separate doorbell for clients. Now Rose, by her own admission, had an extremely high sex drive, and there's nothing wrong in that in itself. And Rose would also engage in casual sex with both the male and female lodgers, as well as people Fred met through work. Yeah, this woman would boast that there was no woman or man who could fully satisfy her, which probably made her husband feel great. Unfortunately, Rose would gradually increase the sexual violence with women, inserting larger and larger dildos, partial suffocation, etc., which, if that's your kink and that's consenting, go for it. But when these women would complain or even just show pain or fear, Rose would retort with, "Aren't you woman enough to take it?" I want to punch this woman. Even though it will hurt me more than her, I'm still, yeah, again, don't condone violence, but yeah, some people just need a punch to the face with a brick. Pushing women beyond their sexual limits was a passion for both Fred and Rose, and they both openly admitted sexual fetishes in strong dominance, violence, and pain. They had a large collection of bondage devices, again, each to their own, just not so much with the Wests. Fred and Rose had an extensive porn collection, which started with harmless magazines and photos, and then went on to include videos of bestiality and graphic child sex abuse. At this point, I feel like the expression sick fucks doesn't even begin to cover it. Rose would oversee the family's finances, with Fred handing over his wages, and most of the money that they earned from Rose's side business went on home improvements. By we get to a level, we think it can't go any lower, and then we think again. Okay, so by 1977, Bill Letts, Rose's dad, had come to tolerate the couple's marriage. So much so that he opened a cafe called the Green Lantern with Fred. I mean, it still went bust, but shows you how well fences have been mended. And this next bit, there's the bit I was talking about, sinking down to another low. Oh, I don't want to say this out loud, but Bill would visit Cromwell Street to take advantage of Mandy's room. Yes, his daughter. Wonderful. Just something seriously mentally wrong. Seriously mentally wrong. With both Bill and Rose, and Fred. By 1983, Rose had given birth to 8 children. At least 3 of them were said to be fathered by her clients, but, out of the goodness of his heart, Fred took the kids on, even telling them that his great-grandmother was black to explain their darker skin. It's always a fucking excuse, isn't it? So, to clarify, the kids... And who had who? So Fred had Anna Marie with Rena. He and Rose shared Heather Ann, May June, Louise, Stephen, and Barry. And then Rose also had Tara, Rosemary Jr., and Luciana. And much the same as when Fred was a boy, once the kids reached the age of 7, they would be expected to complete daily chores. They were only allowed to socialise if there was a parent present, and even then, rarely. There were strict rules and severe, usually physical punishment if the rules were broken. Now, the vast majority of the beatings the children received were said to be from Rose. The source said sometimes that the beatings were irrational. As if beating kids is ever rational, come on. They were indiscreet or just for her own gratification. But she was always careful not to mark their faces or hands, basically anywhere easily visible. For example, one time when Stephen was mopping with a cloth, Rose accidentally stepped in the bowl of water. So she hit him over the back of the head with the bowl and then repeatedly kicked him, telling him he'd done it on purpose. When really, just sounds like she wasn't looking where she was going. But of course, wasn't going to be her fault, was it? And another time, Rose was said to be furious about a missing kitchen utensil. So she grabbed the knife she'd been using and struck May over and over, leaving her covered in superficial cuts. Heather and Stephen witnessed the whole thing, and apparently could do nothing but cry whilst it happened. Those poor kids. At one point, Heather and Stephen bravely ran away from Cromwell Street. But sadly, they both returned after a few weeks of sleeping rough or on friends' sofas. And as you can imagine, they were beaten upon their return. In fact, between 1972 and 1992, the West children would be admitted to the local A&E departments a whopping 31 times. But everything was explained away as accidents, and as such, nothing was ever reported to social services. Rose's violence wasn't just left for the kids. She would subject Fred to beatings as well. One particularly violent altercation in 1974 saw Rose chasing Fred with a carving knife. Creates a wonderful cartoon image in my head, which I kind of need at the moment, because, this is a lot. Now, Fred managed to flee. Imagine if she caught him. He slammed a door between the two of them, and Rose stabbed that knife into the door with such force that she almost severed 3 of her fingers. Yeah. And then in true psycho style, she was said to calmly wrap her hand in a towel and said to Fred, "Look what you done now, fella. You've got to take me to the hospital now." Now, if any of you have watched The Walking Dead, even though Rose doesn't have a South American accent. Even though Rose doesn't have a southern accent. That was awful, I apologise. But I can hear Alpha. You know, "Now, child, you're gonna do this." Yeah, creepy. And I think that's where we're going to pause for today. Next week we will go into more of the abuse of the children and more of the West's victims and the debauchery that took place in Cromwell Street. Bet you can't wait. And then we will do something slightly less dark for the week after. So if anybody's got any suggestions, send them to me at seriouslynowpod@gmail.com. As always, you can find me on the socials at seriouslynowpod. So until next time, lovelies, stay safe, stay free, and stay weird. Bye-bye.